Welcome to this. We're going to try something a little different for those of you online. We're going to try and make sure that you guys get to see everybody in person as they are asking their questions, because we've got all our cameras up and functioning. So even if you guys weren't did watch it online, we hope that you had a more immersive experience. So give Melissa some grace, and we'll go from there. So with that, let's pray and we'll get started. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the many blessings of this day. And Lord, as we move into a new book and a new adventure, we just pray that you would just open our hearts and minds. Lord, we just pray that you'd pour out your Holy Spirit on all of us, wherever we might be. And Lord, even for those who will watch this in the days and weeks and months ahead, Lord, I just pray that you would just open us up to your Holy Spirit, Lord, that we would hear from you, and Lord, that you'd make yourself known as we study your word. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So much like I did with the book of Genesis at the beginning, there's a couple of things I want to talk about, and that's why you guys got good handouts. There's at least one handout for every family household, and there's probably a couple more. You'll want to bring these with you through the first third of Exodus for certain, and those of you online, if you need a copy, don't hesitate to let me know. And if you did get the digital copy, we'll make sure that you get that. And the reason why I sent those is because when you're dealing with this, we said with Abraham, we can't be 100% certain when Abraham lived. We have a general idea. We can get pretty close, but we don't know 100% for certain. We use traditional dating for that. When it comes to Joseph at the end of Genesis and him being in Exodus, in theory, you think we should be able to pinpoint that a little bit more. And by the time we get to Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea and the Israelites entering Canaan, we really should be able to date that, right? The reality is we absolutely know when the three kings of Israel reigned. Saul, David, Solomon, those three, we absolutely know those are firm dates. Does that make sense? So back to 1000 BC, we know the dating of everything. From there backwards, there comes this question, because in the book of Judges in particular, it says, and so was a judge over Israel, almost implying that they were a judge over all of Israel. But some of them seem to imply, when you read their stories, they're more of a regional judge. And it'd be like saying they're a judge over Indiana or the Midwest, but they're being called a judge over the United States. You get what I'm saying? And so trying to put the timetable together is a little more difficult. But by the same token, Egypt as a nation is one of the most prolific writing nations history has ever seen. They put their history all over all of their temples, all over all of their palaces, over their pyramids. They put hieroglyphics on everything. They want to tell their story. So in reality, if they want to tell their story, even if it's not always the most favorable on them, you'd think in theory we should be able to find Israel there, wouldn't you? So with that, there are three different dates. The first page looks like this, and in it, it has what they call the early and the late date. And the third date is actually in between the two. So in the early date of Exodus, this actually follows what Scripture tells us. It's in Kings and Chronicles, it tells us the year that Solomon built the temple and dedicated the temple. So at the top timeline, you see the green triangle. Down at the bottom on the right-hand end, we know the year that Solomon built the temple. That is a firm date. And it says that prior to that, there was 480 years since they left in the Exodus. Well, again, if you do that backtracking, that means they left Exodus in 1446 BC. and that implies a certain set of kings, and that are pharaohs, and that implies a certain amount of things. But that's not the traditional date of the Exodus. The Jewish people say that the traditional date of the Exodus is 1313 BC. That's not on this chart. But 1313 BC, while that's the traditional Jewish date, it has some problems with archaeology. Like, you don't really see any time period of unrest in Egypt, which if they have the 10 plagues and everything gets sideways like it sounds, you'd think you'd have a pharaoh who has a child that dies, and pharaohs are notorious for building their tombs, their pyramids, their temples, and there's not a pharaoh that has a child that dies and they build a temple this time. By the same token, you have the early date, which is the 1270, and this is the late date. This is at the bottom. But the problem is then the years definitely don't line up with Scripture. Now, I've told you guys before, while I am a scientist, I want to dig into the facts. The other side of it is I'm also a man of faith, and I believe this book to be true. So if those two things are true, if we should be able to find the facts and follow the facts, and if this book is true, then as we go through the story, I want you all to make your own decisions. I've made up my decision, but again, I've given you the information, and you'll see it as we go along. You got to make your own decision of when you believe this happens, and maybe it doesn't matter. Be real honest, you might not care when it happened, just so long as that it happened. And there are people who take that route, and that's perfectly okay. But you guys have known me. I like to dig. I want to know the answers. By the same token, I tend to lean towards this early date. But you need to understand, most Egyptologists and a lot of historians and scholars don't agree with that. If anything, they would say if there was an Exodus, they point more to this late date of the Exodus. But again, that causes problems with our dating system in Scripture. So you've got to make the decision of what's most important. Is it that it happened? And I have no doubt that it happened. And that's all you're concerned about. And we read the story for what it is, and then you don't really worry about some of the dates, how long it took them to go from place to place and do things. If that's your primary concern, and then you can deal with the way that the rest of the world handles it. Is it the traditional date, what the Jewish people hold on to? And outside of the Jewish faith, there are very few scholars or historians who kind of follow their timetable. It's a kind of a moderately abridged timetable. Does that make sense? By the same token, I gave you guys this sheet, and this is a sheet that shows who the pharaohs would have been if you take that early date in mind. For those of you online, this was the last page of the handout, and it changes some things. I mean, because again, you need to understand when this is translated into English. Oftentimes they use the names that we're familiar with. So even if the Hebrew says it's such and such king, if traditionally we've said, well, that's Ramses II, so then we're just going to say it's Ramses. Does that make sense? Even if that's not what the Hebrew says, and even if in the past we hadn't known who lines up as who, because again, think of this reality of, in the New Testament, Paul is his Greek name. Saul is his Hebrew name. It's the exact same name, but in two different languages, it's pronounced two different ways. Think of the name in English, George, and in Spanish, it's Jorge. You get what I'm saying? And so that has happened throughout history. And after the King James Bible in 1611, all of a sudden you had this authorized set of names. And from that point forward, they always used those names. They always used those place names, these people names, because everybody just assumed that's what it is. Does that make sense? A prime example, if you remember, when we told the story, my favorite story in Genesis of Abraham, the Western story, it says he chased him all the way to Dan, right? But Dan wouldn't even exist until the Israelites were back in the land some 500 years later. It had a different name then, but the last time they recorded the story down and they told the story, they used the current name of the city for that place. Does that make sense? And Melissa, you're gonna have to watch make sure that I don't miss any chats, but I want to make sure you guys get what I'm saying? And in this story in particular, because Hollywood loves this story, anytime Hollywood gets involved in something, you always know they're going to make it their own. And they're going to make decisions and they're going to do things. And sometimes they're faithful to the text and sometimes they're not.
So Tom Hanks didn't play Moses?
I may even get some flack by saying that I'm not for sure Charlton Heston's version of Moses is close to biblically accurate. I might get crucified for that one, but so do you guys understand the footing that I'm coming out of right here from the beginning? I'm going to assume the dates in here are correct, even if the names that we have historically put with it may or may not be. Does that make sense? And the truth of the matter is you're going to see the actual story doesn't name the Pharaoh. Just like whenever Jacob and Abraham were in the land and they kept going up against Abimelech, remember, Abimelech was a title. It's the prince. It's not, but we don't get the name of the prince. We just get that he's the prince of that area. And so Scripture is very fond of that. If you're not a God-fearing person, we may give your title, but you don't warrant us giving you your name. Does that make sense? So, any other questions before we dig in? All right. So I've switched Bibles, just so you guys know. I've tried to find one that's a little easier to read because there are some times as we were going through Genesis, I kind of regretted grabbing the New Revised Standard, but and Jim always brought one. I think he's online. So, but with that, again, I mean, you guys have watched most of them online, but since you're new for in person, every question is a valid question. And if your translation says something different and you wonder why, don't hesitate to ask. So with that, we are in Exodus chapter 1. And my first paragraph is verses 1 through 7. So that's what I'll read, and we'll see what happens as we jump in the story. So, Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each out of his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So what do you think? When you notice, what questions does it make you ask? Anything? I don't know the significance of this, but it starts off naming the sons in chronological order and then it changes.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not for sure why. They get the first 4 in order, but then from there they change it. So, any thoughts? Oh, maybe we'll see, but I just want to point that out, that it's a little different, right? No questions yet? Yes.
You mentioned that you changed your Bible, but you didn't say what version.
Oh, sorry. I am currently using the English Standard Version. So if you have that chart I gave you early on that shows paraphrase, thought for thought, word for word, remember that kind of, it goes like red to green kind of thing, somewhere there. This is in the thought for thought, word for word category. It's kind of over here, a little more little.
Someone has a comment.
My footnote says about verse 7, from the death of Joseph to the rise of a new king was more than 200 years. So we're not quite to the new king verse yet, but one of the questions, and this is where that dating thing comes into play, is how long does it take to get from the generation of Joseph to the generation of Moses? And for this, and that's a good question. And for this, I want to turn back to Genesis chapter 15. And let me get it right for verse. So I think what the paragraph that I want to look at is Genesis 15, 12 through 16. And it says, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And I don't know if we got into great detail about this when we read it the last time, but in looking at that particular question, notice God says they're going to be in Egypt for 400 years, and it's going to be 4 generations. Now, for us, 100 years is not a generation. We tend to say generations come about every 15 to 25 years, somewhere in there, right? Usually about 20 years is a generation. But so on the one hand, if it's 400 years and if it's 4 generations, man, those are long generations, and they are very, very prolific people. They're having lots and lots of kids. But the reality is, it's a fair bet that that Don, your note about it being 200 years is probably pretty accurate. And let's look at what's happened in America over the last 200 years and how much we've forgotten about what has happened. There's a story that gets told, and there's 95% of everything else that happened, right? I mean, even what we get told about the Revolutionary War today, you know, that's verging on 250 years. We get told the story, but most of the details are lost. And now, of course, there's debates about which of our presidents were good presidents and which were bad presidents, and now our culture's changed, and so the definitions change. And so it's easy to think that if what God said in Genesis 15 is true, that they're going to be in Egypt for 400 years, and it's going to be 4 generations, then after 2 generations, that's still pretty much enough to see the culture shift, isn't it? I mean, we see that today. We don't even have to go 2 generations to watch culture shift. So, Don, I think that note is probably worthwhile. And again, if you want to jump ahead and look at that sheet that I gave you, it shows that, you know, a couple hundred years, a couple of different rulers, and things really shift. By the same token, there is this big movement in Egypt, and Egyptologists talk about this, and that's the word Hyksos. Hyksos is the Egyptian word for outsiders. And there is a period that starts in 1657 BC and goes all the way until about 1542, maybe a little bit later than that, where Egypt is ruled by non-ethnic Egyptians. And so if the Hyksos are in power, or even before that point, it makes sense that a non-Egyptian would be okay with a non-Egyptian like Joseph coming into power. Does that make sense? And so it makes sense that during the Hyksos rule, someone like Joseph, a non-Egyptian, could come to second in command. And so I just leave that there but then when the Hyksos get overthrown and now we're back to ethnic Egyptians ruling, they wouldn't like non-Egyptians having any kind of authority or any kind of place of power or any kind of place of position. Think of what happens in our culture with political parties. Every time the other political party gets elected president or takes over Congress, things rustle, don't they? And that's what we have going on here. So this verse 9 that you're bringing up, Dawn, is exactly that. And so let's go ahead and read the next paragraph, 9 through 14.
I still find it interesting too that there were 7 years of drought. We're talking about 200 years later. Why did they keep hanging out when it's like they forgot about the land that God was giving?
Yeah, and I know there's another comment. We're going to get to that, but I want to deal with Dean. Extremely fair point. 7 years of drought. The 7 years of drought is gone. And remember, Jacob is in Egypt for like 14 to 18 years before he dies. And they stay in Egypt. And but then we wonder, 200 years later, would they really remember 7 years of drought 200 years later? I mean, now Egypt, of course, made their laws, but the people in general, I mean, are you concerned about what happened to your relatives 200 years ago? Does that affect your daily lives? You don't even know your relatives. Crystal, does it make a difference that at the end you said people of Israel became fruitful and mine says children? So the children of Israel implies that we're talking about Jacob's children. The people of Israel implies that we're talking about the whole clan, that their identity is shifted. They both mean the exact same thing, but by the time we get to what will be current in Exodus, they no longer identify themselves as the children of Jacob. They are the nation of Israel. They are a people, not just a single family. Does that make sense, Crystal? I hope so.
One thing about them staying, back to that point, Jacob wouldn't want to leave his favorite son, who he thought was dead. He knows Joseph can't leave Egypt because he's in charge.
Joseph's not leaving Egypt. So, and if everybody else has a favorable spot, if you're getting wealthy and things are going well, why do you really want to leave? But then once it's time to leave, okay, Braxton? Did you have something? Oh, you're telling me, Crystal?
Yeah, she gave me a thumbs up.
Okay, awesome. Because I can't see my screen now, so I'm kind of lost. You guys got to keep me honest, okay? All right. So, Exodus 1, 8 through 14. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh some store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So if you remember, when we left the Israelites at the end of Genesis, They were the only people group in Egypt outside of the priests that were not already slaves to Pharaoh. So it would make sense that all the people wouldn't like the Israelites either, because they've got a level of freedom that nobody else in the land has outside of the priests, and they don't worship the same gods. Now, again, I'm going to point to this notion of the names of Pithom and Ramses. If you go to the early dating, there is no city of Pithom. There has not been a Pharaoh named Ramses, and therefore there is no city of Ramses. That's been a problem for the early dating. However, there's recent excavation where Ramses is, and underneath the rubble of Ramses is an older storehouse city where they have actually found dwelling places of Canaanites. And they have found a statue of someone who looks like a pharaoh sitting on a throne with the symbols of the pharaoh, the symbols that designate a leader. And this person doesn't have the traditional pharaohs, with the beard and the tall hat. It actually has Canaanite or Semite hair. So there, for me, and I can't remember the name of the place. Avaris, I believe, Avaris. If you do some looking, that it's interesting. I think again, I think it points to a fact that this early dating could be true. But regardless, these two city names, again, as the story gets told, when a city changes its names, they don't still go with the old city name. A fact of this, Melissa graduated from Washington High School, Washington, Indiana, southwestern Indiana. But if you go back 200 years, the stories don't ever talk about a Washington, Indiana. It doesn't exist. They talk about Liverpool. But after the Revolution, they didn't want their town to be named Liverpool, which points to England, so they changed the name to Washington to celebrate a general. Do you get what I'm saying? So just because these names are here, I don't want us to get too hung up if you're a person who wants to go digging, because those names don't match up with the dates. Does that make sense? What else do you notice in here? What other questions do you find yourself asking in 9 through 14?
I don't think I would just willingly become a slave, so I'm sure it happened gradually over time or something. I'm free and I'm rich and got maybe slaves of my own, and then they come and tell me I have to be a slave.
I think it happens much the way, I don't know, say Putin invades Ukraine.
I thought there were more Israelite people than there were Egyptians, no?
There were, but remember, the Israelites, when they came in, did they come in as warriors? They came in as shepherds. So there's this reality where while they weren't slouches, they weren't necessarily people who were fighting men. They weren't seen as a threat when there was just 70 of them. Yeah, I mean, you don't want to mess with the shepherd. They fight against lions and wolves and bears and all kinds of stuff over there. They're not slouches, but you don't see them as a trained military force. But as they get bigger and bigger, you see the Pharaoh saying, they're not really us. And if an enemy comes in, we don't want them siding against us, but we still want them here. We want their money. We want their commerce. They're making us better. So let's just lock it down. And we see this all throughout human history, that there comes a point where Melissa and I, we watch a lot of historical fiction stuff. And it's amazing how often the king sees a family of people that are getting too big and too numerous and too much influence, and the king just knocks them all out. or sells them all off.
Amy's got a comment.
Amy, but they multiplied like rabbits. Well, I mean, Jacob had 12 sons. So, you start multiplying that out. If they all had 12 sons, that starts to add up really quickly. And he only had 12 sons and one daughter, so they had to get wives from somewhere. And so now if you start doubling that up, there's 24 at that generation. And if you 12 sets times 24, or, all of a sudden it starts getting a large number really quick. And now you're making me question, Amy. So if we have Jacob, not Jacob, then we got 12 kids, right? But that's with their wives, so that's 24. And if each of them have 12, then that's another 144. So that's 288, right? Plus the 24, so we now have a total of 312. And then if you go multiply that out again, oh dear Lord. Anybody got a calculator? Come on, my accountant. I'm surprised they didn't already have it up. Yes.
1,728.
728, which then means we got 3456, plus that is 3768. That's generation 1, generation 2, generation 3. Okay, take 1728 times 12.
20,736.
736 times 41
41, 472.
or 72.
Yeah.
Okay, and then add to that 3768.
45,240.
45,240.
Yeah.
Okay, fourth generation, take 20,736 times 12.
248,832.
Okay, multiply that times 2.
497,664.
And then add to that 45,000 or 240.
542,904.
Okay, and this is the moment the story starts. Now remember, I'm just gonna jump ahead. I'm gonna pull a Jim Burke here and I'm gonna say, remember, Moses is 80 years old when he comes in. So let's go ahead and do it one more time.
Listen, I can't see the thing.
So 248,832 times 12.
2,985,984.
Okay, times 2.
5,971,968.
Okay, 968. Okay, add to that 542,904.
6,514,872.
I thought this was Bible study, not math class.
Well, I just want to show you, if it's only 4 generations over the course of 400 years, wow, can you see how one family of 70 people could turn into 1 million pretty easily? And of course, we're not going to get the total number that comes out of in the Exodus, I don't think, until Numbers, but still, I just wanted to prove that maybe the Bible's numbers aren't that off. Yeah, the average household today in America is what, 2.54 kids. Is it still that? I mean, it's probably a lot less than that now. Yes, sir.
I just looked up and the population of Indiana is 6,785. 6,785,500.
So 6,700,000. So basically, in 400 years, they go from 70 people to the state of Indiana. It's possible. I mean, that's really possible. That's a lot of food. Can you see why the Pharaoh might be a little frightened now? Just saying. Anything else from?
Because the Pharaoh's family probably didn't multiply that like that either.
Oh, no, because he doesn't want to have that many kids. He wants to make sure that his successor is clear and there's not any infighting after he's gone. So ruling families often have much smaller families, whereas peasant families can multiply like rabbits. Does that work for you, Amy? Just saying, it's. I mean, remember when we did the math for, from Adam to the time of Noah, we were talking billions of people. So, anything else? All right, next paragraph. Let's finish chapter 1. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of them was named Sephra, and the other Puah. When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, you shall let her live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So Pharaoh's plan B, right? He's subjected them and they're slaves, but they're still multiplying like rabbits. So he calls the midwives and says, okay, when you go to birth them, you have a rule now. If you find it's a boy, if it's a girl, nope, it's fine. Girls can live. What do they say? Sorry, our ladies are a little different from your delicate Egyptian women. They just have the baby, pop it out, and go on about their way.
It makes you wonder why he didn't kill them then.
That's what I'm thinking. That's a little bit of at least a sassy statement, isn't it? I mean, that's some gall.
I mean,
right?
if you were on the fence about killing them, they mouth off to you, that'd have been, you're done.
Yes, Grant.
What's the point of being a midwife? Wouldn't you be out of a job?
They're at least implying that they're not very good at their jobs. But a midwife, remember, we're talking about a time period in human history where doctors were a rarity. So a midwife is the equivalent of a doctor. But there's two of them. For how many people? I mean, I don't know how many babies are born, and I don't know how big of a region Goshen really is, or how far they've been subjected. It kind of implies they've been sent all over Egypt to be slaves, right? So if these two Hebrew midwives, maybe they really are having problems of getting there in time. Could be.
Where does it say two?
Their name.
Their names, they're given the names of the two midwives. Shiphrah and Puah are the names of the midwives. So there's only two. But yeah, I'm kind of with you, Steve. If I was Pharaoh and these two women aren't doing the job to my level of satisfaction, I probably would off them.
But if there's only two, then who's gonna birth the children?
But they're not birthing the children anyway. So Pharaoh's plan A isn't working to curtail the Israelites, and Pharaoh's plan B isn't working to curtail the Israelites. Any other thoughts about chapter 1? Thoughts or questions about chapter 1?
It's almost like God rewarded the midwives and made their families multiply.
Well, yeah, I mean, so now you've got pregnant midwives, so can they get there in a hurry to kill babies if they're pregnant themselves? No. It's almost as if God maybe isn't too happy with Pharaoh. I don't know. Maybe. Just saying. Any other thoughts or questions? Don would think these two midwives are more the head midwives and they're or more underneath. Very well could be. And if that's the case, then they can get away with what they're saying. If they're the heads of their guild, I guess is what you'd call it, a guild of midwives. And then the underlings, like, we can't control what everybody underneath us does. Plus, those Hebrew women, they're just more sturdy than your delicate Egyptian flowers.
Because they're on the birthing stool.
Because they're on the birthing stool. And remember, you made them slaves, so they got to get back out in the fields or whatever it is they're doing, making bricks. Yes. Amy, and these are not Egyptian names, are they? No, these are very much Hebrew names. One before that, did we cover how Israel became slaves in the first place? It doesn't specifically say how they became slaves, but it just seems very clear to me that the new Pharaoh comes to power. He is frightened by this large group of people who are foreigners in their midst and they've not integrated into Egyptian society. And remember, that's part of why, that's what I speculated at the end of Genesis, where Joseph says, no, tell them you're shepherds and you'll get to this place over here. They won't want you to intermix with them anyway. Well, that policy, that fear of the other is now playing itself out on the other side of the coin. They didn't want them to intermarry before. And now that they've not intermarried, now they're angry that they didn't intermarry and become part of the Egyptian culture. So I'm fairly certain that's why, Amy. But almost everyone became slaves through the famine that just mentioned. And that's absolutely right. Remember, I don't know, maybe I don't know if you logged on at that point, but not just, you guys are taking care of it. You guys are on the ball. The reality is, because they were separate, God took care of Joseph's family, and they were not made slaves in the same way that the rest of the Egyptians were back then. And so I think that it's one of these cases where, again, outsiders, different, they're not part of us, we're afraid of them, let's make them.
Would that be like everybody from Indiana moving down to Mexico City?
Yeah. Or, when we invade Florida, I don't know, something like a spring break or something like that, I'm pretty sure the locals don't like it. They want the money, they want the commerce, but they're glad whenever we come back to Indiana. Something like that. But imagine if we all went down there and just stayed.
It's basically a disorganized movement of people.
Yeah.
There is no leader, it's just a huge amount of people move into an area.
So it's this, what was small and containable at first, and we'll let it be. A couple hundred years later, they're not small anymore, and that area, even if they're staying in a certain area, that area is now packed. And, it's becoming a problem. So it seems reasonable for me. I don't know that they became slaves slowly. I think it had to have been a very quick move. In fact, I could almost imagine the new non-Hyksos, the non-outsider Pharaoh saying, we're just going to take care of those Israelites because they're a problem. So if you make sure I'm Pharaoh, then we'll take care of those outsiders. That never happens, does it? Just,
Was the Israelites self-sufficient, or was the Pharaoh actually helping feed them? And might that be a concern for why he was concerned about their growing numbers?
well, for the most part, being people of the field, I would say they would be far more self-sufficient than the rest. And they still had their wealth, they still had their flocks, they owned all their stuff. So they had things to trade with, where all of the Egyptian people were essentially under a primitive version of communism. They all worked the ground and gave everything to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gave them back what he thought they deserved. And so you have this group of people who are fully autonomous and relatively wealthy compared to the rest of the Egyptians, and all the Egyptian people who are living under a not as nice version. So it makes sense that they would want them to be subjugated, and probably would not do it very kindly. Any other thoughts? Yeah, and Goshen was again, it was their area where their flocks and herds and animals were raised. And they didn't want to be around those stinky 4-H fair barns. You know, it's okay if they come to town once a year, but let's keep them out there where we don't have to. Just trying to use some more modern examples.
I was just thinking of the incident here just the last week here in Decatur.
Oh, yeah, something about a plant to deal with animals, and the smell might be something we don't want to deal with. That would never happen, would it? Just say. Jump into chapter 2. Anybody else got something online? Make sure. All right, chapter 2. Looks like my first paragraph is 1 through 10. It's a bigger chunk than what I like to go, but we'll go with it.
Mine ends at 4.
Mine ends at 4.
Yours ends at 4. Okay, we'll end at 4
5.
and we'll pick up with 5. All right. So 2, 1 through 4. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. So we have a lady who escaped plan A for subjugation and is still having kids, and plan B with the midwife, she apparently passed that one because she's got a son, and she hid him as long as she could. And here's the irony of this. What is it that Pharaoh said to do with all boys?
Throw them in the river.
Throw them in the river. What's she doing? Technically putting him in the river. She's following the rules. Didn't say you couldn't put a basket underneath it. What we got? How do you keep a baby quiet? That's a really good question, Amy.
Benadryl.
Voice of experience.
Wonder why that boy's quiet. Quiet? And then there's Sydney. Yeah, well, she was a girl, but you wouldn't have to throw her in the mud. So she's following what Pharaoh said, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's something I had never paid attention to before until I read this getting ready for today. I'm like, that's a little ironic. Following the rules, completely following the rules.
I wonder what she's seen in him that made her think he was special.
What did your wife see in your kids?
Look at me.
I don't know that she necessarily sees anything extraordinary in Moses, simply that this is her child. What mother in her right mind would want to destroy her child, even if it meant bringing down the wrath of the king? Yes, Grant.
It did say that they're just married, so this could have been their first son, so it's not like she would have.
She has a dog.
But she has an older sister, or this child, and technically this is the third child.
But she wouldn't have to get rid of them, so like,
But all sons, any Hebrew boy is. We don't know the time frame here, just being clear. It doesn't say how long this Pharaoh's policies come into play and how long it is before we get to Moses. Just being very clear. What else do you notice about verses 1 through 4?
I don't know where she got the darn bitch.
I mean,
She's a slave.
she's a slave working in brick factories. It's probably pretty excessive. Oh,
Yeah, that's what they did to
I
I don't know.
don't know. That's a good question.
It's dry, you know, and everything, wouldn't think that tar and pitch would be.
It was like a factory down the road making hot asphalt.
The asphalt factory down there. So, again, so let's go back to the map. Over here is Goshen, right? Now, if you remember where I showed you those maps and where I say, historically, they say that the crossing of the Red Sea happened. The area of Goshen, just to the east of Goshen, is an area known for marshy swamps. So the notion of getting the bulrushes is probably not that difficult. But the pitch and tar, that's a little different. So either she's working as a slave in some kind of industry where those are available, or she has some resources, maybe she's a slave making boats.
My version says papyrus basket.
So papyrus and bulrush are essentially, they're the same thing. Think of big cattails and things like that. It's these big marsh grasses. And papyrus is all over the place, and it is one of the most preserved writing. Its first paper is made out of papyrus. And so this is just all over the place there. It's very prevalent. So they probably, even if she's taking these bulrushes, papyrus, whatever you want to call it, no Egyptian officer is going to be concerned with a woman taking papyrus. And even if she's weaving a basket, no one's going to think twice about her weaving a basket. Now, seeing her coat it with pitch, or that might cause some questions, but realistically, again, it's a basket. Who's really going to pay attention to a basket? And this is one of those instances where ladies, remember, we said how, by this point in time in human history, women aren't necessarily in places of power. You know what's good about that, right? Exactly. Women don't get looked at. The soldiers don't pay attention to the things women do. So a woman carrying this basket, around isn't going to draw any attention. Now, yes, she needs to find some kind of prehistoric version of Benadryl to keep the child quiet, but I'm sure there was figured out. Yes.
Papyrus is gonna blend in with the rest of the papyrus along there, so no one's really even gonna see it meshed in with the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, so not only did she make a basket, not only did she follow the Pharaoh's letter of the law, but she's effectively hiding him in plain sight. Any other thoughts? Read the rest of the section. 5 through 10. I want to read verse 4 again to remind us where we're at. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. So now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young woman walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." Yes, Greg.
Okay, so in the little footnotes, my Bible says Moses sounds like a Hebrew term that means to lift out. Why Hebrew if she's Egyptian?
So Moses is an Egyptian name, which means to be drawn out. This is the same word that's used for, like, if you go to a well and draw water, drawing bucket down. It's interesting because his Hebrew name is essentially the word for, it's Moshiach, and it's the word for a midwife. And what does Moses end up doing? Birthing a nation? Yes, sir.
So it says that they took away, or she like sent the child away, and then the child grew, and then he became her son. So does that mean like she had like no contact with the kid until he was like a certain age?
This means that Moses, a Hebrew child that should have been killed, was thrown into the river at the king's orders, found by the king's daughter, sent back to his mother, where his mother was paid to raise her child until he was old enough to be weaned, and sent back.
So how old approximately was he then?
Bare minimum, he would have been at least 3. And I've read that sometimes they call a child weaned when they're closer to what we would say going to school age, so 5 or 6. When they are old enough to begin being taught. So for the first 3 to 6 years of Moses' life, he was living as a Hebrew. Doesn't that kind of break some of what Hollywood likes to say, you know, about how Moses didn't realize he was a Hebrew? Just remember, read the story. I mean, I don't want to infer too much, but you got something, Grant?
Well, I mean, I did have something, but then I realized you said that he was put in a basket. Now that there are other babies, I was like, wouldn't she have found a whole lot of more babies on the side of the riverbed? But like,
Hey, you know, there are things like hippos and crocodiles in the Nile River too, so there's a reason that, you know. Any other comments? Nothing yet. So any other questions or thoughts so far?
Well, I don't think you answered his question. And did the princess have any contact with the boy until he was 5 years old?
Nope.
No, like play dates or anything like that, or?
Maybe. I mean, yeah, she might have checked up on it, on the child. But the reality is his formative years where you learn your identity, where you learn who you are, you know, he's being raised amongst the Hebrews.
Seems like she would have thought of that. Wouldn't she want him to be raised as an Egyptian?
Well, I think she was probably worried about what her father would have done to him.
Well, on the one hand, maybe there's a father part. On the other hand, she's a princess. Does she really want to be raising a toddler?
No, but it seems like she would get an Egyptian woman to raise it more so than a Hebrew woman.
Probably, but I'm thinking this kind of makes an assumption about the kind of.
She's just a stupid princess and didn't know.
I didn't want to say that, but you kind of get this implication. Yes, Braxton.
I feel like Don brings up a pretty good point.
Unfortunately, children who are stolen at an early age, say 3 or 4, don't seem to remember their original families.
Like, I don't have my first memory, like, I can't remember past, like, whenever I was 4.
Some of my first earliest memories are around age 4, yeah. Now, but here's the thing. That's still old enough to have known something else, but that doesn't mean that they would remember. But the truth of the matter is this princess doesn't quite strike us as the brightest bulb in the bunch.
You said it.
Chris is the one who brought up the points. I mean, you know, if she's thinking clearly, surely they have Egyptian nursemaids who could have raised this child. So unless your point is valid, she's just taken pity on this baby and thought, dad's policies on this aren't real good, but I better not bring the baby in. It's not like a puppy, you know, that we can just put out with the other dogs.
As soon as her dad finds out she found him in the Nile River, then, you know.
We're going to know exactly who this is. And having an Egyptian child, a baby amongst, when dad said, kill all the Egyptian, or non-Egyptian, the Israelite baby boys, something would be a little fishy here. But whenever he comes back and he's weaned and he's potty trained and, Dad, I've been paying for him all along, so he's mine, right? I can have him. Well, he's not a problem now. He's not going to stink up the place, I guess, with dirty diapers. So it's a little more feasible to adopt the child when most of the hardest work is over, right? That's my thought. But I could be wrong. I mean, we didn't adopt any kids. So we were planning on it. Then we had our own. There were enough of a problem. Leah's old enough to remember the other 3 being problems. There's still problems. Any other thoughts?
Amy's got a comment.
Amy, the princess is at least the very least empathetic. She at least has somewhat of a good heart. You know, she finds this. Again, I imagine that there's probably a part of her that sees the craftiness of following the king's rules to the letter, but somehow managed to save her child. Thinking, okay, that's pretty clever. Maybe she is empathetic and says, yeah, we can handle that. But again, do you see how the actual biblical story differs from the way Hollywood wants to tell this story?
I mean, Moses has an Egyptian brother though, right?
Well, I'm certain he does. I'm certain.
Isn't that who Pharaoh becomes, is his brother?
So this is the daughter of Pharaoh.
Right.
So either her husband would become Pharaoh, or if she has a son, he would become Pharaoh.
In the movie.
In the movie. In the movie, you know.
She could have had a brother also,
She
right?
could have had a brother. Bare minimum, Moses is going to be raised as kind of a part of the family, knowing full and well he will never be Pharaoh. Grant, you don't know what it's like to claim to be the unfavored child. Any other thoughts on 2:1 through 10?
Well, she might have been totally surprised too, because this is the only baby. I'm wrong there. I mean, all the rest of them are supposed to be thrown in. And, you know, crocodiles or whatever, and then to find this living thing, you know, I mean, that would be, wow.
Lovingly cared for and put in a nice little life.
I get this picture, and this is, again, this is making Hollywood level assumptions here, but I get this picture of the pretty princess finding the Easter egg along the river. Ooh, look, it's a basket. What's inside? Okay, it's a baby. Well, I don't want to raise a baby. You raise it, you know, and then bring it back to me when it's a kid, and I can play with it then, and it's not a problem. But it's mine. It's mine. Exactly.
I found it, it's mine.
I get to have a kid and I don't have to go through the pain of childbirth. Sorry,
Well, how old was the princess or the Pharaoh's daughter?
we don't really know. She might have been fairly young too. It doesn't mean that this is an adult. In fact, there's nothing that says that this is an adult. Could you imagine Pharaoh having, I don't know, a 6 or 7-year-old daughter who finds this basket down along the river and says, Daddy, Daddy, can I keep it?
Well, no, she's mature enough to know not to bring it to the house, but she follows the instructions of this other Hebrew girl who could be older or younger than her to be like, hey, do you want me to go get you a Hebrew woman? She's like, yeah, sure, that'd be great.
Because then Dad doesn't have to know about her.
She's old enough to know,
You know,
probably like preteen.
again, we're starting to border here on where Hollywood does things, but at least here it makes sense within the context instead of just completely changing the story.
I don't know, she may have been older and barren and she just wanted a kid and prayed to the gods and she wanted a kid and poof, there's
Found one
a
on the river. Could be two. Next paragraph, 11 through 15.
Amy's
What?
got a comment.
Oh, Amy's got a comment? And she must have offered some kind of protection to keep her baby from being killed. Exactly, makes perfect sense. I mean, if you're a wealthy girl with all kinds of money to spend and your daddy's in control of the kingdom, then you can do whatever you want. Just for the record, Blake and Grant still claim that Leah and Madison are the favorites.
Madison and I claim the boys.
I also claim that the boys are my favorites.
You have to agree with your wife.
Listen, I may have married.
Braxton, be quiet. I'm just gonna warn you, just be quiet.
I may have married her. I kind of like Grant a little bit more.
Just because I'm a better child doesn't mean I'm the favorite child.
Anyway, moving on. Before we go home to Paget Civil War.
Nice knowing you, Braxton.
You're sleeping on the couch.
Sleeping with the fishes in the St. Mary's River instead of the Nile. Verse 11. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people. Question. It says his people. I thought he didn't know he wasn't an Egyptian. Just throwing that out there. Sorry. Back to, and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why did you strike your companion? He answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Stop there. There's a lot of this little bitty paragraph, right? Let's game this out. So
Amy says hers, NIV, and it says his own people.
it stresses his own people. So does Moses know he's a Hebrew, or does he think he's an Egyptian?
Well, surely he knows he's not an Egyptian because he has none of the,
Characteristics?
well, not necessarily characteristics. He doesn't get any of the perks probably because he's not.
It's very clear he's not
He's not an heir apparent.
an heir apparent.
So he has to know he's not an Egyptian.
So again, when Hollywood wants to make this big deal out of him discovering that he's not an Egyptian, I'm pretty sure this happened, he knew all the way through. And scripture implies that. Now, he's the luckiest Israelite in the land. Let's just be clear. wasn't there some other story about an Israelite, maybe the luckiest Israelite in the land, and the rest of the Israelites weren't too happy about that? Wasn't there some kind of, didn't we read a story like that recently? You got something, Kay, or are you just scratching? You're laughing at my embellishments? So, he knows that he's a Hebrew. He knows that his people are not being treated fairly. And he goes out, apparently somewhat frequently, to check on them. And the Pharaoh has no problem with this. He's just letting it be. I mean, his daughter, pinky finger wrapped around her,
And he probably goes, Mom, I'm going to my friend's house.
I'm going to my friend's house. And it's interesting. So he sees a Hebrew particularly being dealt with harshly, and he ends up killing the Egyptian and hiding him in the sand. Who are the people in that story? You have Moses, the Egyptian, and the Hebrew. That's it, right? If Moses didn't tell anybody, and the Egyptian's in the sand and he can't tell anybody, who told people?
Well, but it's not saying that no one saw him, it's just saying he didn't see anyone.
He didn't see anyone, so we'll give him
Doesn't mean
the.
nobody saw him.
It doesn't mean nobody saw him, but who is he around? His own people. Who sells out Moses?
Well, if he's the only Hebrew boy about to live and he gets to live in the palace, of course they're gonna be like, what
They're
good is
gonna
he
be
doing?
jealous.
He's trying to
Yeah.
save me.
Jealousy again.
Jealousy rearing its head.
So would it have had to have been the guy who he was defending?
The guy he defends sells him out and spreads the story about how that son of Pharaoh, that grandson of Pharaoh who gets to live in the palace. Yes, Rex.
What if he spread this in not a negative way? It's like, you wouldn't believe what just happened to me. This guy who is supposedly a Hebrew but lives in the palace and everything like that, he like just totally saved my life. And then it spread and spread and spread.
And people
And
put
then they-
two and two together.
Telephone game.
The telephone game, but regardless, what Moses thought he did in secret to stand up for his people quickly gets back to Pharaoh. Very quickly. And notice what the Hebrew says to him. Who made you a prince and a judge over us? I'm pretty sure that's Pharaoh. I could be wrong on this, but when you're adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, you kind of get to live by different rules. Maybe.
White privilege.
Egyptian privilege, not white privilege, Egyptian privilege, But, okay, so telephone, and maybe Braxton's right. Let's give Braxton the prop. I'll give you a silver star. It's not a gold star yet. We'll see if it turns into a gold star. Could it not have been bragging? Well, yeah, he could have been bragging. He could have been. But, so the Hebrews are now, you say, what are you gonna kill us too, kind of thing? But he defended the Hebrew yesterday. But it doesn't matter what you did for me yesterday, right? It's just what you're doing for me today.
My Bible says that he would have been 40 years old when this happened. So he's been in the palace quite a while.
So even if, let's say he got to stay with his mom, let's say even to 6, or let's go even 10. He's still been in the palace now for probably about 30 years. Yeah, he's lived a posh life. And
he really doesn't fit into either category.
no,
The Egyptians or the Hebrews.
And I think that's one of the biggest points here. Here he is, he's trying to help out his people. He keeps going out, he sees their affliction, his heart goes out to him. He knows that that's who he should be. But who really wants to give up living in the palace? And so he's trying to, in some way, do right by his people. But as what typically happens, how often when we try to do something right, does it get screwed up and go sideways on us? That never happens, does it?
No.
So yeah, if he's about 40 years old right now, he's clearly known who he is. It's clear that everyone in Egypt knows that he's part of Pharaoh's household, even if he's not really an Egyptian. So he doesn't get to live in either world fully. He's not a blood Egyptian. He'll never rule. He might get, some cabinet post somewhere, but he's not going to ever really be the person in
But he's
charge.
probably wearing the fancier clothes.
He's wearing the fancier clothes because, again, if he's living in the palace, he's got to look like he lives in the palace. He can't be slumming with those Israelites down there. They're
A
not.
fancy sports car.
Got the fancy sports car. He's got the
Luxury chariot.
the chariot with the spinner gold wheels, and the white stallions pulling it, not the black ones, the white ones, that are bathed every day. Any other thoughts? So he gets caught. Pharaoh finds out and says, okay, dear, I'm sorry. I know you've adopted this kid, but he's killed an Egyptian. His time in the palace is over. Pharaoh now is ready to kill Moses, who has lived in his household for at least 30 years. So on the one hand, I would venture to say Pharaoh's a little bit conflicted. I mean, this guy's been living in the family, probably ate at his table most nights. He's been at all the family events, but he's killed an Egyptian.
Or he's looking for an excuse.
Or maybe he's looking for an excuse. I tried to kill this man 40 years ago, and if it hadn't been for my stinking daughter, I would have already been done with it. The ugly stepchild he wants to get rid of. Either way, we now have either the political side that he has to deal with Moses because he's killed an Egyptian, or it's the ugly stepchild he's wanted to get rid of for a long time. And for what he did, right? Oh, imagine that, a descendant of Jacob running away. That never happens, does it? "400 years and 4 generations later, the family traits are still strong, aren't they? Any other thoughts? All right. So I'm going to read 15 and into the next paragraph, just to kind of pick it back up. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Before I read the next paragraph, so just so you understand, Goshen's here, right? Egypt is along the Nile. Midian is actually over here in what we would call modern day Saudi Arabia.
This man's covering that.
This hand is coming in.
There you go.
So Goshen, Egypt along the Nile. Midian, is down along this way.
I can't see you move your thing.
So a couple day trip,
Say that again.
a couple day trip.
If you remember, it took them a month to take Jacob back here to Beersheba. So he's by himself. bare minimum, we're talking probably a week on foot running. And he's probably wearing, you know, those brand new Nikes that look real pretty but fall apart when you actually do anything in them. I mean, he's probably pretty ragged once he reaches the well, right? This is a good 150 miles that he has traveled. Just for the record.
Well, and did he know how to survive on his own?
That's probably a pretty good point.
But you gotta stop and think, he did kill a man, so.
He did kill a man, so he at least has some level of physical prowess. But he's been raised in Pharaoh's house, at Pharaoh's table. So probably wilderness survival skills is not something, I mean, you know, he probably wasn't a part of, you know, the Nile Scouts or whatever they might have had. I don't know. Trying to think of what they might have done, you know?
Or what he may have seen. I mean, he may have seen the Pharaoh have people killed too.
I'm certain he watched the Pharaoh have people killed. So he probably at least learned that, but caring for himself may be a little more questionable. So, okay, so we know where he's at now, right? He's in Midian. He's went all the way around what we now call the Sinai Peninsula, and he's in what we would call Saudi Arabia. Verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. The shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom. For he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land."
Here, I'll water your flock and then you can have my daughter.
Amy, some royalty are trained militarily. That's very true. He could have been trained for military. So this is one area where I'll be honest, I didn't study that part of Egyptian culture as to how they trained there. I think bare minimum, Moses was probably given some strategic training. He was probably taught to read and write in cuneiform, which is only one of the first written languages. It's a little. I mean, he's not the heir apparent, so you know he's a little more expendable than anybody else in Pharaoh's house.
Now, why would the girls thought he was an Egyptian?
So he clearly is dressed like an Egyptian. He's got.
On his old traveling clothes before he went.
He did put on his old traveling clothes before he fled Egypt in the middle of the night. They don't see him as an Israelite. They don't see him as a Semite, someone from Canaan. They clearly don't see him as that kind of person. He looks like he's from Egypt.
Why do you suppose, even though he identifies himself as a Hebrew, that he wouldn't portray himself that way or say, well, I'm not an Egyptian or
Again, he's living in Pharaoh's palace. Pharaoh doesn't want one of those Hebrews living in the palace. He's got to look the part, is my assumption.
It seems like if he's hiding out from Pharaoh, he would change his identity.
If he was traveling, he'd be safer as an Egyptian.
He probably would be a little safer as an Egyptian amongst other people, but again, he's running almost in the middle of the night to get away. This is not one of those things where he's, you know, it's time to go get the go bag. We're leaving. he's prepared for this. He's been prepared for this for years, right? I mean, you're living in the palace. Of course you have a bag for whenever dad no longer wants you around. I just think he left. He all of a sudden realized his murder got caught. He realizes now he's no longer going to be accepted in Pharaoh's palace, and the Israelites aren't going to defend him. I mean, bare minimum, they're calling him out. What may have started as wow, look at the son of Pharaoh who saved me, has now put this big target on him. And so he's just getting out of Dodge while he can. And so these 7 daughters don't see him as one of them. He's definitely not a Midianite. He's not dressed. I'm assuming he has to be dressed like an Egyptian. And probably to your point, Gary, being dressed as an Egyptian outside of Egypt would probably cause people to be a little more cautious. But he also just literally traveled 150 miles across mountainous terrain. And notice the daughters are, I don't know, at least frightened enough that they don't invite him home to dad. Did Egyptian royal families have piercings and tattoos? I don't know.
Didn't we, when we were studying Joseph, that they shaved their heads and they didn't have beards?
They absolutely shaved their heads. They would have shaved all of their beard, but that little part you see on the sarcophagus, and a lot of times that was even fake. So they were clean shaven. In fact, it was the thing I do know is they shaved all their hair. They wanted no hair whatsoever on their body. They were some of the first to create, eyebrow pencils. I don't know, my daughter might have 1 or 2 of those around. You don't use them very often, but I've seen them. So realistically, Don, I don't know if they would have had piercings. Again, I can tell you the pierced ear was often a symbol of being a perpetual servant or slave. So maybe not piercings, but they could have had tattoos, but bare minimum, after a week, he wouldn't have grown enough hair to look like he was anything other than an Egyptian. Because that was.
They knew actually what an Egyptian looked like out there. They just made a stereotype type visions of what they look like.
Could be.
And it's a little young girl, she's probably never seen one before in her life.
I mean, yeah, again, this is one of those areas where we have a little bit of leeway to kind of fill in the gaps, but it's evident they know he's not a local. And they call him an Egyptian. And so I'm assuming it's probably because of the no hair thing, because that was absolutely a regular Egyptian thing. Not today, but back then it was. You had to have time in order to shave. Slaves didn't have time to make themselves pretty.
Are the Midianites descendants of Esau or Ishmael?
That's a good question. Time for the box of knowledge, right? Almost forgot I had it here. Who are the Midianites? Descended. Oh. Let's see what a quick search gets us. Oh, the Midianites are from Abraham's second wife, Keturah. Midian was one of his sons. So these are cousins of Isaac. So they're related, and therefore, notice what they call their dad. What's the title that's given to him? A priest of Midian. And so therefore, if Midian was the son of Abraham, which God do they serve? The same God as the Israelites. Or should. We'll make that assumption until they prove to us otherwise, right?
Innocent until proven guilty.
Innocent until proven guilty. And so then he stays with them. He is notice it says he is content to dwell. That's what the English Standard Version says. And for the record here, basically, so he's about 40 years old approximately whenever he commits this murder and flees. And he spends another 40 years with the Midianites. So that's long enough to get married and to have a couple kids. Notice he's a son of Levi. And Levi was from Sarah's side. Remember, she named her kids happy things, right? But how does he name his son? I'm a sojourner in a foreign land. Is that a happy name? No. Again, it's like naming your son Sue or something like that. It's probably not going to help him fit in with the locals. Anything else you noticed through 22? Let's finish the chapter. We're at 8:32, but I want to finish the chapter. So, 23 and 24. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groanings, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew.
Mine says knew it was time to act.
It adds that piece of time to act. One of the key things, and we saw this clearly in Genesis, right? Even whenever the family kind of pushes God away, God is always there. God is with them every step of the way. And this here at the end of chapter 2 of Exodus, God is saying very clearly, I know what's happening. I haven't turned a blind eye. I'm not oblivious to what's going on. I will do something about it. And to your point, you like to make, God is patient beyond what humans are patient. But by the same token, remember the people, if this is 4 generations, they're still living over 100 years of peace. Now, once they're getting forced into slavery, that probably curtails some of their life expectancy a little bit. But any final thoughts?
I wonder, whenever God had spoke to Abraham and promised him a family of many generations, and it says Abraham, Isaac the same, and Jacob. But Joseph is a big part of the story. How come we never add Joseph to this?
So the reality is Joseph's story is not tied to the land of Israel. Joseph's story is tied to Egypt. And therefore, the patriarchs are those who were promised the land of Israel. And each of the 3 of them get a direct promise from God that their descendants will inherit this land. We never get Joseph getting that message from God, which is why the patriarchs end with those 3, and Joseph and the children of Israel, the 12 tribes, it starts a new era. They end up living into the promise, but individually we don't get stories of them walking with God and getting that message directly from God. That make sense? Any other final thoughts? Let's pray. Lord, we often get impatient and we want you to act And yet, Lord, just as we read, you are long suffering and you are patient far beyond anything that we can imagine. Lord, I pray that when we face the trials of our life, that we are patient and continue to depend on you. And Lord, when we are the ones who have sinned and done wrong, I pray that you will grant us the grace that you have proven that you granted even to Moses. Lord, if you can use a murderer, then you can use us. Lord, I pray that we would live lives that honor you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. And kill the recording.